All right, start out. For those of you that were here last week, you might be able to answer this. What's the difference between these two kinds of books?
One you read, and then one's just for information.
Yeah. You read this like a novel, it's got a story, it's got all kinds of things in it that are literary devices. This one, you just look up a phone number and use it. Okay? Which one of these is the Bible supposed to be most like? Yeah, it's supposed to be more like the novel, isn't it? Moby Dick. Not that it's Moby Dick, but it's supposed to be more like. But how do people too often treat the Bible? Too often they treat the Bible like a phone book or a set of encyclopedias. I want to know everything there is about this particular thing that I think is wrong, so I'm going to look up all the verses, then I'm going to bombard somebody with those verses and tell them why they're wrong with my preconceived idea as to what's going on. Or I want to find out something good, like all the verses about love. Okay? That is not how to read the Bible. And it took me most of my life to figure that out. Because we're not always taught that. But the Bible is a story that starts in Genesis, and it does not end as a storybook until the end of Revelation. Yes, there are individual books, and they can be taken and studied individually, because they also, at the same time, have their own purpose. But we can't get lost in that purpose and not see that forest for the individual trees. And very, very, very few people look at the Bible that way. And I'm trying to emphasize that here, where we go to church here and to individuals everywhere that I can talk. I've been doing this for quite a few years now. There's a different way to look at the Bible. And once you start doing it and understand it, you can't go back. Okay? And I hope that you get that. Part of the reason why, in recent years, I have started to say that the Bible is its own evidence that there is a God is because of looking at the Bible this way. So, if the Bible is more like a novel, like a story, then it's got to have a subject. Right? Every story's got a subject. What's the Bible's subject? I said that last week.
The sea.
No. You're close, but it's not exactly true. What's the Bible's subject?
God.
God. It is in fact, if you look at the Bible one way, the Bible's an autobiography. It uses human history as a method of showing who God is. And the reason why the Bible had to be written was because after Adam and Eve sinned, things started drifting off until we get in Genesis chapter 4, and we've got a really bad person that was from the lineage of Cain that was killing for pleasure. And then we get to the time of Noah when it was even worse than that. People had forgotten who God is. So once he picked Abraham and finally picked the children of Israel, it was them and Moses and the ones that came afterwards that started writing the Bible. Why? To reintroduce who God was. So it's a story about God. That's its subject. Sometime if I get a chance, I might play this video I have. I didn't think about it till just now. I've got it on my computer somewhere. And it lists, in a very dramatic sort of way, hundreds of words that are used to describe God in the whole Bible from Old Testament to New Testament. And it is amazing when you look at it that way that you don't understand that the Bible is about God. Every time a new attribute about God comes up, there's a new descriptor in the Bible about him, so we can understand him better. Now, Jason, subject is God. What's the main theme?
The sea.
The seed. The seed that starts back in Genesis chapter 3. All right, we also said that was very, very important in a lot of different ways. And if we had to put the Bible, its storyline in one sentence, can you remember what that storyline would be? what that sentence would be about its storyline?
Is that, you will bruise his heel and he will crush your head?
We're going to get to that in a second. That's a little bit different. No, the Bible is about, it's a long story of how a holy and righteous God can dwell with an unholy and unrighteous people. That's where the seed comes in. Because the seed is going to be the method for that to come true. Right? So in a nutshell, you remember that the subject is God, the seed, or the main theme is the seed. There's a lot of sub-themes in the Bible, but the main one is there's a promised seed, which turns into a son, which eventually turns into a priest and a king. As you go through the Bible, get through the time of David and beyond. Right? There's more and more attributes given to him. And then that the Bible is the long true story about how a holy and righteous God can once again dwell with his unholy images. If you understand those three things and you digest them, then you will understand the Bible, I think, much better. Next, what is the literary structure that we said that the Bible has? And we said that it was like a three-act play. And that when we get to Genesis chapter 3, that's where the plot point 1 changes things from good to bad. Now, notice that this was happening, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 were happening before Moses ever wrote. And as Moses wrote it down, he wrote it as Act 1 and plot point 1. And then, of course, there was the change that happened, but Moses didn't start writing this until thousands of years after those events had already happened. And it continues through the rest of the Old Testament, and after Moses dies, then there's Joshua, Judges, etc., 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 and all these books continue with that same themes, continue with that same subject, continue with that same what it's about, and the authors didn't even know each other. It wasn't written at the same time. But when you put it into a collective, it's kind of a big evidence that someone was actually directing this book other than the individuals that wrote it on the paper. Right? See where I'm going with this? All right. And then, what Jason just mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, that we also have in the Bible a device called the Chekhov's gun. Right? And that is something that happens in a play or a story or whatever. In Act 1, if you have a rifle hanging on the wall, then at some point in the story must be fired. Right? And we said that Chekhov's gun don't have to be guns. They can be just about anything. Like in Superman 2, I think it is, where Superman decides he's going to not have his powers anymore. And so he wants to marry Lois Lane, and he has to reveal himself to her, and has to become human. And he tears down his man cave where all of his power comes from. But she fiddles with this, drops it someplace, and when the world's coming to an end, because at the end of the movie, Superman has no powers and he can't fix things, he goes back to his origins, not knowing what to do, thinking he can plead with his ancestral parents, and he finds what she dropped. And that gives his power back. So in Superman 2, that kryptonite that she dropped was the Chekhov's gun. There would be no other reason to show her drop that. So if the gun is shown, if the kryptonite is shown in Act 1, it better be fired or it better be used by the end. The Bible has a Chekhov's gun, and that is where Genesis 3:15 comes in. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her seed and your seed. You shall bruise his head, you shall bruise his heel. There is, number one, seems like a statement that doesn't need to be made. It's cryptic. I honestly think by now that Adam and Eve, especially Eve, knew that this meant something enough to think that maybe her next son or her next son, etc., might be the person that would save them. But they knew that once this happened, they were in bad shape because they're the only ones that knew what it was like before the fall. And then saw it afterwards. Not only did they change, not only did the relationship between them and God change, but the world changed. We don't know exactly how it changed. It wasn't like the garden anymore. So why is any of this important? The Bible has 40 different writers living at different points in history over a 1,500-year period of time when it was written over all of human history. Yet it's collectively they wrote one long story with one subject and one theme, one point. How can that be under those conditions? I don't think I have time, but you'll get the idea if I just describe this. I was going to have pieces of paper here and have every one of you guys write down 2 sentences about some little story that you were thinking up in your head. You couldn't talk to anybody else. You couldn't look at anybody else's paper. Just write down 2 sentences about some sort of story you think. And then I would collect them and I would read them in succession and see if they made sense as a story, whether they had one theme. We can sit in the room and try that. It ain't going to work. These guys didn't know each other over a long, long period of time about all of human history, and it worked. That's kind of some supportive evidence that the Bible is really what it claims to be. And most people miss this because they're not looking for it, or they don't think it can happen, or they just don't want to believe that there could be possibly a God. But that's exactly what did happen. The Bible was written in such a way that every aspect of it points to in a specific direction. Okay? First of all, like I said a minute ago, our seed turns into a son, and our son turns into a mediator under Moses, and our mediator turns into a king under David. So it's not just that he's telling Israel's story, which he is, but he's using that as building blocks to tell us who the Messiah is. The seed when it does come. And it was mystery up until that point. But here are some of the devices used to point this out in the Bible. Redemptive historical progression. All right? We already also looked at, in the first few lessons that we had, simply getting the history right. All right? When you look at the history and the archaeology, you remember we went through several of those sessions where it's not something that was made up. It coincides with real history. We've got promises fulfilled. We've got longitudinal themes in the Bible. We got writings of the prophets. We're going to start dealing with that a little bit here in a day or in a week or so. We've got New Testament references in the Old Testament, and we got typology and symbols. We're going to talk a little bit about typology today. All right? What do all these do? They all point to the same place. That's what's important. Every single one of those aspects that are in that book all point to that promised seed. That's why it's the main theme. Okay? It's not an accident. It was done on purpose. So, these are a few of those literary devices. One of the main devices, and I could go into quite a few different kinds of devices that the Bible uses. All right? I may have done that in a past class or two. I know I've done it in the adult classes. But this idea of symbols and types and foreshadowing is one of the more important ones. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what's called types today. All right? The word type is from the Greek, and it means a blow. It is a mark left by a blow. So, a lot of times I bring in a hatchet and a piece of wood, and I set it on the floor and I whack that wood with that hatchet as hard as I can, and I say, which one's the hatchet? All right? Well, this over here, the wood, has the mark of the hatchet, doesn't it? And then there's the hatchet. So if I take the hatchet away and I don't show you the hatchet, the mark that's in the hatchet actually, or mark that's in the wood actually proves that there is a hatchet. There is something that makes that mark. That mark is the type. It's not the actual thing that makes that mark, but it is a type. It is a foreshadowing that there exists something that can make that mark. So if we were doing that and somebody had been whacked over the head with that hatchet, and the police were looking for him, then they would look for the real hatchet that matches so they could find the murder weapon. Okay? They could find what's called the antitype, which is the hatchet. Well, these are some other ideas here. A hatchet don't make the same kind of mark as a chisel, and a chisel don't make the same kind of mark as an awl, as it has. That's what that thing's called over there. So when the Bible uses the idea of type, it is a type is a person, a place, a thing, or an event that in some way foreshadows or predicts the coming promised seed, or something specifically about the promised seed, but most specifically about the seed itself. And there are lots of them in the Old Testament. In this way, a type can be thought of as a real-life picture language. So we're going to see it in things like the life of Abraham and Isaac. Is picture language that predicts and talks about in a foreshadowing sort of way of what's going to happen to that promised seed. And so is a lot of the other stories. In fact, just about everything on every page has something to do with a prediction of that promised seed. And there are hundreds and hundreds of them in the Old Testament. I don't know them all, but once you start looking for them, you can find them a lot easier. So when the Bible writers recorded an event in the Old Testament, God has them write it down in such a way that it will also make for an illustration of something that's going to come in the future. The Old Testament is chock full of these kinds of illustrations. We're going to take a look at some right now. First of all, I want to make sure that you understand this. In the Old Testament, we're talking about real people, real places, real things. We know they're real because the first part of this second part of this class, we dealt with the fact that the events in the Old Testament align with secular historical events. So we know they're real people. So God's using real people, places, things, and events that acted out in history that point towards something that's going to happen in the New Testament. So the type becomes an antitype. And what those people, places, things, and events we're actually talking about were all the promised seed. So a type always points from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Somebody asked me once, so I found this thing in the New Testament. Is it a type? Is it a shadow? I said no, because by the time the New Testament came, Jesus was already there. All right? So I can't point to him anymore. It points from the Old Testament to the New Testament for that purpose. Anyway, that's my belief on that right now. And I have no reason to change this anymore. Let's talk about one first. The New Testament tells us that a blood atonement would be necessary to cover sin. When was the first time that a blood atonement was made for sin that probably didn't make any sense to you when you first read it, and probably didn't make any sense to you when the people that were involved acted it up? Wake up.
Would it be when God made garments for Adam and Eve?
Yeah. The Lord made garments of skin for Adam and Eve and clothed them. Why is that the first foreshadowing that a blood sacrifice was necessary? And you just think, well, it's got animal skin on it. Well, an animal has to die. In order to die, it's got to be like slaughtered, which means it's got blood. And what were these for? They were for to cover up the idea that they sinned and didn't feel that they could approach the presence of God anymore. Okay? That's the underlying meaning of it. It was blood that would be ultimately necessary to cover sin. And the second time we see this is when? In the Bible. Next chapter. How about Cain and Abel? Okay? We argue, I don't know if it's supposed to be fruit and vegetables or whether that mattered, etc. No, you're missing the point. The point is, God started this idea in Genesis chapter 3 that it would take a bloody mess to clear up the sin, and this is the second example. Yes, I believe that Abel had a better heart. It tells us that. But God also had chosen the bloody sacrifice that Abel made and knew and has given us another foreshadowing or another symbol or another type of Christ by that story. All right. Let's move on to another one. And there's a lot of different ones that show that bloody sacrifice as we go through the rest of the Old Testament. All right? We can't deal with all of these. If we tried to deal with all of them, we'd be here for another year just dealing with them. I'm just pointing some out to you as we go along here so that you know what to look for, why they're there, and what to look for. All right, I want to look at Enoch. Enoch is an important person showing up in Genesis, I think it's 5, right? I didn't write that down, but I'm pretty sure it's 5. Why was he a type? Number one. And what was he a type of? And one of the most important aspects of the beginning of Genesis is a repeated phrase. All right? It's the phrase that's used over and over and over again at the very beginning of Genesis that everybody wants to just skim over and go to the next chapter and start reading because it gets so boring. What is it?
Lineages?
Yep. Only there's a specific part of it that's more important. Nothing's more important than the other, but should stand out like a sore thumb when we don't think about it. Because we think somebody begot somebody and they lived so long and they got somebody. There's a reason for that. And if you want, I can show you that sometime. All right? There's a real reason for those. But what does it say after that on each person?
Oh, and then they die.
And he died. And he died. And he died. And he died. Why is that there? Because God said, you shall surely die. And guess what? We got a list of the first umpteen members of the human race that died. And then he died. And then he died. And then he died. All right? Until we get to a guy named Enoch. What happened with Enoch? He died. Okay? In fact, it's interrupted in Genesis chapter 5, starting in verse 23. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of blah, blah years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. There's an identifier. There's a description, so to speak. There's no description on any of the rest of those, but there is on him. He's supposed to stand out because of all the other people that are described there. He's supposed to stand out. And then he was no more because God took him. He is the only one that didn't die. Why didn't he die? Because he walked faithfully. Is that a type? Is that a foreshadowing? If so, how so? I think it is. Enoch then becomes a type of what will happen to those who are true followers of God. Enoch becomes another clue that something or someone is coming to save mankind from this horrible predicament that they're in. In other words, there's another hope that something's going to change if you walk faithfully. I think that's the way we're supposed to read that. Someone's going to come and solve the death problem, so to speak. All right, let's move to another one. When we discuss Noah in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, what do we most often talk about in Bible classes? Maybe you haven't been in enough of them to know this. Anybody know what's often talked about? You mean all the animals could fit on the ark? Could the water really cover the whole world? You know, I've been to the ark. I've also seen all the things that, the one in near Cincinnati down there. And I've also read all the articles on how many animals probably had to be there and they were babies. I think all the animals could fit on the ark. I've also seen Walt Brown, his video and description of probably what the earth was like before and when the fountains of the Great Deep broke up and what probably happened to change the landscape and cause a flood that could cover the earth. And I believe that's all true. That's not what's important, right? And I can show you that Walt Brown one time because I think it's fascinating. It dispels a whole lot of things that people have had wrong. And they also talk about things, how hard would it be for Noah to preach to everybody, or what Gopher Wood is. But these, as important as they are, they're not the focus of what's supposed to be going on. And we're focusing our attention on these questions, and we're missing, I think, the main point. Look at this right here, Genesis 6:14. Make an ark out of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, pitch it on the inside with pitch on the outside. Okay? It's important here that most translations only use one word pitch. They don't use two. Very, very few, I think the King James is one of them, actually does what the original Greek does and uses both words. The word pitch is used twice. But the real important thing is there's two different words used for pitch. All right? And they have two different meanings. They actually have more than two different meanings. Both of these words can mean sticky stuff that you put on like glue. Okay? Like black tar or something. But they're hardly ever used like that. But it kind of fits because Noah had to put something to keep the water out. But those words mean a whole lot more than that, and they're not being translated that way by any of the translations, and I find that as a big problem. Their primary meaning is not sticky substance that keeps water out. In fact, the usual word that means a sticky, waterproof stuff is used often in other places in the Old Testament, but it's not used here. Here's why. The first one, coffer. It means to cover up. 94 times in the Old Testament, 71 times it's translated to make atonement. One example is Leviticus, chapter 14:20, where it says, and the high priest shall offer a burnt offering and the meat offering on an altar, and the priest shall make kafir, atonement. So if that's true, why wasn't it translated atonement here when it is pretty much every other place in the Old Testament? Because the person translating the Old Testament is thinking he needs sticky stuff, so that must be the one that he should be put there. See what I'm saying? Look what the second one means. Kofar, a ransom, a bribe, a price for a life. It's used 34 times in the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 6, where we're at right now, is the only place where it's translated pitch out of those 34 times. And an example for that is Proverbs chapter 21. The wicked are a kofar. Doesn't say the wicked are a pitch. It translates it correctly. It says the wicked are a ransom for the righteous. So those two terminologies right there, those are telling us something very important about this plan. Okay? They're types. extremely important types. I suggest that the ark was not covered just with pitch, but it was covered with atonement and mercy on the inside and a bribe or paid ransom on the outside. That's what the Hebrews trying to convey. These two Hebrew words, way back in Genesis chapter 6, tell us that a ransom and a price must be paid in order to receive atonement, reconciliation, forgiveness, and mercy. In this respect, pitch becomes a type of what Jesus is going to do. Just like the animal skins, just like Cain and Abel's sacrifice, just like so many other things. This idea of receiving atonement because of a ransom that was paid is one of the more important themes that run throughout the entire Bible. These two words foreshadow two of the most important aspects of the coming seed. Ultimately, it is Jesus that will become the pitch. It is Jesus that will become the bribe or the price that has to be paid so that mankind can be redeemed and have reconciliation with God. But at that point, it's the ark. So what does the ark become a symbol of? A type of. Think about it this way. Those that are saved are inside of it. Those that are not are outside of the ark. And to do it, they have to pass through the pitch. So what does the ark become a symbol of?
Christ.
In a sense, kind of. I think more specifically, it's the church. Okay?
All right.
I'm not saying you're wrong, but I think we can make a better correlation of it being a type of the church. You have to pass through the pitch, which Jesus is, to get into the church. And you had to do the same thing then to get into the ark, to be saved. Okay? So, yeah, there's a fine line, but I think you see the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So much is this important that 1 Peter chapter 3 says this, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you not as a removal of dirt from the skin, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience. Okay? Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So water is another theme. We can go through that one. It runs as a theme all the way through the entire Bible, starting back with when earth was created and everything was without form and void and it was covered with water. And then water here, water leading to the temple, water going through water to get to the promised land, water getting saved from the Egyptians, the stream of water that led to the temple, and I think it is Ezekiel, and then Jesus saying, "I'm the living water." There's so many of these, and then the river that is in Genesis chapter 2 that run through Eden, compared with the river that's going to run in the last 2 chapters of Revelation. Water is a theme all the way through it. All right. What's important? What's another important aspect of water? Whether it's getting into the ark to get away from the water, or going to get baptized to be getting into the church, was a symbol, which was symbolized by the ark. It's all important. See how once you start seeing the Bible this way, you can't go back. All right? Let's look at another one. So in the Bible, we read about a son that is to be sacrificed by the Father. The only son of the Father, the promised son. The son is essentially dead for 3 days, but then rises from the deathbed. And in the story, the actual sacrifice is a substitute. And it's a ram, a male sheep. Who's the story about?
Isaac.
Abraham and Isaac. But who's the story really about? The father and the son. Okay? He willingly laid on that altar. All right? For 3 days, they marched from where they lived to this spot. He was essentially dead for 3 days. But then he arose, and a lamb took his place. Okay? Jesus was the lamb. They call it a ram, but all that means is another word for a male sheep. I think your ram is put into those translations mostly because they don't know the story, or I think they would put the word lamb in there. But I'm not positive. I'm going to do another one. All right? This is a character in the Bible that has a special birth. Beloved son of the father, forced to go to Egypt when he was young, scorned by his brothers, became a servant, resisted temptation, sold for silver, falsely accused and condemned to die, was between two other criminals. One was saved and one was lost, gave life-giving bread to all who would come to him, and when his family found out who he was, they were drawn to him. Who's it talking about? Yeah,
Joseph.
it is. But every single one of those things can be applied to who? The main theme of the Bible. This is a foreshadowing. Makes Joseph a type of Christ in every aspect. Genesis starts out with pictorial, real-life, living people being used as examples of when Jesus comes, these are the things that, when that promised seed comes, these are the things that they're going to do. And God chooses these lives to have these authors write about way back, and Moses writes them down, okay? But then as it progresses, it's not as much the pictorial languages, even though there are still some in there. It becomes even more descriptive in certain ways, because later on there's prophecies that are made specifically about this. And there are other kinds of literary devices used, right? But Genesis is chock full of these. Excellent. The parallels between Moses and Jesus are very numerous, too numerous to ignore. I mean, look at these. Son of Abraham, son of Abraham, son of God, son of God. Infant kills. I mean, you look right down this list, and boom, 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 one after another. He had to be hidden after he was born because of the government was looking to kill all the babies. Like Joseph, Moses was raised up in the household of the king and ascended to the right hand of the throne. These are describing Moses when he was a child, but they're also describing Jesus in his lifetime, what happened. Moses was the person that led people from bondage to the promised land. Jesus does that too. Moses was a covenant giver and a mediator between God and man. All characteristics of the Son of Man, of Jesus himself, which are typified in Moses because that's the way God decided to write it. What about in Exodus chapter 12, when we're told for the first time? Yeah. So let me hustle through a couple more of these to get going. What about when the Bible in Exodus talks about the Jewish Passover, a specific time of the month, and a lamb without blemish? Who's it talking about? Okay? It says that the blood will be a sign for you in the house where you are, and when you see the blood, I will pass over you. Okay? Where did they have to be? In the house. What had to be on the house? The blood. Where do we have to be? In the church. How do we get there? Through the blood. Okay? It's the same story. Over and over and over again throughout the entire Old Testament. Hebrews tells us, wait a minute, I think that might be premature. Ceremonial laws. The law of Moses has several different categories of laws: the civil law, the moral law, and the ceremonial laws. And too often we get bogged down on which ones we're supposed to keep and which ones we're not, and whether we're supposed to keep any of them. Basically, the moral law, the Ten Commandments, hasn't changed since the beginning. And I've got a whole series on that up online for anybody that wants to take a look at that. It's like 9 or 10 lessons long. The ceremonial laws, though, were for specific purpose. They were given and then acted out over a period of 1400 years for the specific purpose of showing how salvation works and what the Messiah would be like. Most of these ceremonial laws were types of Christ. The sacrifices were types of Christ. The priest was a type of Christ. All of these. The scapegoat was a type of Christ. The Day of Atonement was a type of Christ. All of them were. And that is what Jesus fulfilled, and you didn't have to keep them anymore because now the types had to be gone because Jesus was finally here. This is true of the Sabbath rest, the high priest, the tabernacle. All these others were just as important. Even the parts of the tabernacle and the different kinds of things, each one of them point to Christ. And then, of course, the Day of Atonement, which we mentioned just a minute ago. One more, real quick. Genesis chapter 3:15, we just said, makes it clear that there's going to be a head crushing. Right? A little bit cryptic. And we said that it's the Chekhov's gun of the Bible. So, where do we read in the Bible about a son who fights someone with scales that would be a symbol of the serpent against all odds and succeeds by crushing the head?
David and Goliath.
Yeah, you got it. The Bible goes into a very, very specific description on what his armor was like. The Bible doesn't waste space. There's a reason why. Because symbolically, they're describing him as the serpent. And David, of course, is going to become the one through whom the king's going to come from. Okay? Jesus makes that clear in the New Testament. And it isn't that he can't lift the sword, because if God wanted him to lift that sword, he'd give him bigger muscles. It was because he wanted that head crushed with that stone, because that goes back to the head crushing back in Genesis chapter 3. Doesn't use the word crush, but it said that that's where he got it. That's where the stone hit. It's a head crushing. So, there are a lot of these. The question I might ask is, does this prove that the Bible was written by God? And the answer still is no, unfortunately. But it's no. But the chances of these kinds of things happening by accident is highly unlikely. Just like we said, the odds against the eye happening by chance, the odds against the bacterial flagellum being assembled through the chance evolution over time, highly unlikely. We're mounting more and more and more and more, and now internal information in the Bible, more and more and more. There's overwhelming evidence that shows, to me, this is the only way that it can be. Right? None of this could have happened by accident. All of this evidence that is there is from God, and shows that it's him that wrote the Bible. And there's other books to show that. We use this one for our Bible classes for the kids. Right here. It says, Jesus Storybook. Jesus on every page. And the neat thing about it is the lady that wrote it goes through this kind of procedure, and every story that one tells directly from the Bible shows a link to the Messiah. All right, last verse. Peter said this. I think I quoted this verse last week, but I want you to get it in your brain. It says that he, talking about Jesus, became it, talking about the church. So Jesus became the church's servant according to God's commission that was given to me for you. Okay, Paul's talking about himself, to the Colossian people, to make the word God fully known, the mystery that has been hidden through the ages and generations, but has now been revealed to his saints. What was the mystery? I think you can say that the Bible, in a sense, not only is it an autobiography, but it's a mystery novel. What was the mystery? who's the seed? And it's these kinds of things, like any other mystery novel, that come up as you read the Bible that are hint after hint after hint, after clue after clue after clue, after type after type after symbol, to get us to the point where finally, when that Chekhov's gun is fired, we know who that mystery seed is. That's how the Bible's constructed. That's how I think we should read it.